A few videos back, we asked the question of whether the goal of human intellectual life should be a final synthesis of all oppositions, or the dissolution of the very framework of oppositional thinking. In situating Hegel alongside Madhyamaka Buddhism, I propose that Hegel's absolute knowing is not in fact a static culmination, but the self-recognition of the process of becoming. Following that video, I did a bit more digging into this topic and found that the thing I was trying to express has been much better expressed in a 2005 book by Catherine Malabou called The Future of Hegel. I also found an essay which further develops this line of thought by Borna Radnick, which is called The Absolute Plasticity of Hegel's Absolutes, and which is particularly relevant to our previous discussion. So the following video has been adapted from this essay because I think this will be incredibly helpful for all of us who have an interest in both Hegel and continental philosophy, as well as those more quietist modes of spirituality which are found in the East. I hope you enjoy. The importance of the notion of the absolute in Hegel's system naturally leads to an image of a totalizing, all-consuming form of absolute idealism. This is a misconception. Hegel actually distinguishes between three absolutes: absolute knowing, the absolute idea, and absolute spirit. Hegel's absolutes are concrete universals, entities that Catherine Malabou calls plastic. For Malabou, plasticity means the capacity both to receive and produce form. This plasticity is not merely a property of the absolute, it is the very engine of the dialectical process in Hegel's philosophy. Hegel's absolutes are absolute not because they are fixed or transcendent, but because they embody an unlimited, self-transforming movement. Each absolute, through dialectical self-movement, shapes and is shaped, a process that is always relative and contextual, never static. In this sense, what is absolute in Hegel is not a final, unchanging entity, but the ceaseless self-mediating activity of the concept itself. Hegel's philosophy is therefore more an affirmation of relativism than of absolutism, though it is a relativism that learns and develops through its own history. Absolute knowing is not an objective knowledge of something called the absolute, nor the knowledge of an object that may be called the absolute. While Hegel does occasionally use the word absolute, it is usually in response to the assumptions of his contemporaries, who posited an undifferentiated absolute as the foundation of philosophy. When Hegel uses the absolute as a noun, he is typically referring to the philosophies of Spinoza or Schelling. In his own system, Hegel does not treat the absolute as a substantive entity. Instead, following Kant, he uses absolute primarily as an adjective, to mean without limitation or restriction. Kant defines absolute as that which is valid in every respect, opposed to what is merely relative. Hegel adopts this sense of the term, applying it to his three absolutes. Thus, absolute knowing is knowing that is effective without limitation. The absolute idea is an idea valid in all respects, and absolute spirit is spirit that permeates every relation. Thus, Hegel's absolutes are modes of being or knowing that are not restricted by external limitations. The absolute is a dynamic, self-determining process rather than a fixed metaphysical core. In German, Hegel uses two terms that can both be translated in English as knowing, Wissen and Erkenntnis. Wissen refers to knowing as an immediate, direct state or activity, while Erkenntnis refers to the process of coming to know, or cognition, which involves recognizing or understanding something that is initially external or unfamiliar. So, for Hegel, what is cognized is contrasted with what is familiar or well known. Absolute knowing is not the objective cognition of some external absolute, but a form of knowing, Wissen, that is immediate, comprehensive, and self-relating. Knowing, therefore, does not necessarily involve the process implied by cognizing. In the Phenomenology, Hegel rejects the idea that cognition is merely a tool or medium for grasping the absolute, as this assumes an unbridgeable gap between the knower and the known. Instead, he insists that the path to science, Wissenschaft, is itself already science. The process of consciousness arriving at absolute knowing is itself an instance of absolute knowing. So, absolute knowing is not the knowledge of a thing called the absolute. It is the culmination of the dialectical process in which consciousness recognizes itself as both subject and object. Absolute knowing is both the result of the process of cognition, Erkenntnis, and the immediate knowing, Wissen, that emerges at the end of this process. It is a knowing that is both mediated and immediate, both process and result. Hegel summarizes this in the preface to the Phenomenology when he says, "The truth is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, namely, to be actual, subject, the spontaneous becoming of itself." The absolute and absolute knowing are results that return to themselves, active and self-creating. Spirit, for Hegel, is not a fixed being, but an ongoing movement and activity, whose end is also its beginning, and whose knowing is the self-mediation of the whole. So, the truth is the whole, and the whole is the journey of consciousness throughout its entire development. The purpose of this journey is only discovered at the end, when consciousness can retroactively recognize the end product as the very principle that motivated the entire process from the beginning. And this is not just a linear progression towards a goal, but a movement that repels itself, appearing to encounter something other, yet discovering at the end that this otherness was always an aspect of itself. As a concrete universal, absolute knowing contains all its particular moments within itself, but these particulars are not external or alien to the universal. What makes universality concrete rather than abstract is that any apparent otherness to the universal is only other in appearance. Ultimately, it is an expression of the universal itself. Thus, when Hegel says, "The whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development," he is articulating the self-repelling, self-returning movement of spirit. Absolute knowing only attains what it already was through the movement of self-alienation and return. The progression of spirit is thus a return into itself, which is realized only retroactively when the journey is complete. Spirit is the active final purpose that creates itself. The final purpose, absolute knowing, is nothing other than the immanent result of its own dialectical self-activity. Throughout its development, spirit experiences self-alienation as encounters with otherness, generated by the internal contradictions of consciousness itself. But what appears to be an external opposition is, in truth, a product of consciousness's own movement. Only when spirit reaches absolute knowing does it recognize, retroactively, that the alien other was always its own self-alienation. So, Hegel is not concerned with what is known, but with how we know. At every stage in the Phenomenology, consciousness claims absolute knowledge of its experience, only to find its certainty undermined, moving from sense certainty to perception and so forth. Each stage is marked by the conviction of having attained the truth, yet each is ultimately shown to be limited and relative. But if every previous attempt at self-knowledge fails, what ensures that absolute knowing itself does not fail? The answer lies in the recognition that absolute knowing is not a fixed possession or static endpoint, but the ongoing self-reflexive process by which consciousness recognizes itself in and through its own history of failures and self-overcomings. Absolute knowing is the dynamic, living result of the dialectical journey, the whole as the process and return to itself. In the Phenomenology, Hegel writes that spirit gives its complete and true content the form of the self, and thereby realizes its concept. This is absolute knowing. It is spirit that knows itself in the shape of spirit, or a comprehensive knowing. Here, the true content, the absolute, finally receives its proper form, that of self-consciousness, and the truth is grasped both as subject, self-conscious act, and as substance, absolute being. But what exactly is this content? Hegel states that the movement and moments of self-conscious knowing show themselves to be such that this knowing is a pure being for self of self-consciousness. It is I that is this and no other I, and which is no less immediately a mediated or superseded universal I. The content is the I that communes with itself in its otherness. To put that more simply, self-conscious knowing exists for itself, to be aware of itself as itself. It is both particular and universal, and its content is its own encounter of itself in what appears to be other. It is only in this that the content is truly comprehended. The content is nothing but the movement of spirit itself, the process by which the self seeks truth, fails by encountering apparent otherness, and ultimately recognizes that this other is itself. Absolute knowing is therefore the knowing of the identity of identity and difference, the collapse of the opposition between form and content, as spirit assumes the shape of its own concept. What makes absolute knowing absolute is its recognition that knowing itself is a self-correcting process. Any claim to unrestricted knowledge contains within it the means of its own falsification, revealing its relativity. In this sense, absolute knowing is the absolute relativity of all claims to truth. It is not the knowledge of an object, but a kind of knowing that recognizes that the only truly universal, unlimited knowledge is the recognition of the relativity of all forms of knowing. Absolute knowing is a concrete universal because its universality includes and is constituted by its particular moments and failures. Hegel's absolute knowing is therefore plastic, in the sense that it possesses the capacity both to receive and to produce form. Absolute knowing receives form by incorporating the entire dynamic learning process that consciousness undergoes throughout the phenomenology of spirit. Rather than positing content of its own, absolute knowing takes up all the content generated at previous stages: sensory experience, perception, desire, morality, religion, and so on. But its claim to absoluteness does not rest on knowing every possible fact or content. Rather, absolute knowing recognizes that the real significance of all these stages is not their content as such, but the dialectical, dynamic process by which consciousness learns, fails, and transforms itself. In this way, absolute knowing receives form by acknowledging and formalizing every previous moment, not by treating them as fixed truths, but by recognizing the process of their unfolding, their contradictions, and their transformation. So, although the phenomenology ends with absolute knowing, this is not a termination which provides a definitive final doctrine, but a new beginning. Its openness to new forms of knowledge is what enables it to produce form. It is always ready to engage with new content and renew the dialectical process. Thus, absolute knowing is not a claim to possess exhaustive knowledge of an object called the Absolute, nor is it a claim to finality. To know absolutely is to know without limitation, but the only truly unlimited universal knowledge is the recognition that all knowledge claims are relative. This absolute relativism is what makes absolute knowing a concrete universal. So, how does the universal relativism of absolute knowledge apply to Hegel's other two absolutes, the idea and spirit? While the phenomenology deals with the dialectical movement within sensuous experience, the science of logic examines the dialectical movement within pure thought. Importantly, Hegel insists that logical thinking is not about applying categories to external objects. It is thought thinking itself. The content of logic is the concept, the self-development of the categories of thought. The science of logic is thus concerned with the conceptual development of thinking itself. Its three main divisions, the doctrine of being, the doctrine of essence, and the doctrine of the concept, are all stages in the unfolding of the concept, arising from the concept's own internal development. The relation between the concept and the absolute idea is very important to understand. For Hegel, the absolute idea is the unity of the concept with objectivity, where objectivity means not simply external objects, but the categories and determinations of thought that seem other or outside to subjectivity. It is the way thought relates to what appears as otherness, but this otherness is always included within the process of thinking itself. Objectivity is not outside thought, but a moment within it. The absolute idea is also the unity of the theoretical and practical ideas. Hegel distinguishes between two forms of cognition: theoretical cognition, which seeks to understand or represent the objective world within thought. This is the idea of the true. And practical cognition, which aims to transform the world through action in accordance with the concept. This is the idea of the good. Both forms attempt to unify the concept, subjectivity, with objectivity, but each remains one-sided on its own. The theoretical idea remains limited because it only reconstructs objectivity within thought, leaving the world unchanged. The practical idea, in turn, tries to realize the good by transforming objectivity, but it privileges action over contemplation and cannot fully bridge the gap between the concept and objectivity. The absolute idea overcomes this division by integrating the drive for theoretical truth with the drive for practical goodness. Each aspect reveals the limitations of the other, and their reciprocal relationship forms a self-correcting dynamic unity. The absolute idea is thus an ongoing dialectical process in which theory and practice continually check and reinforce one another, integrating concept and actuality in a universally valid way. This dynamic emerges imminently from the dialectical development of the logic itself. The absolute idea is, as Hegel puts it, the system of the logical. It is the rational articulation of the dynamic present universally in all things. This movement is not transcendental or presupposed, but only becomes fully apparent retrospectively as the logic completes itself. The dialectical method, which the absolute idea articulates, proceeds through a series of moments: an immediate beginning, a transition or negation into its opposite, a negation of this negation which reunifies the first moment as a higher unity, and the emergence of a new determinate term through the contradiction and movement of the preceding moments. For example, Hegel's logic begins with being, which passes into its opposite, nothing, and their unity produces becoming. This process continues, with each new term emerging from the dialectical interplay of earlier moments. In this way, the absolute idea is not a fixed content, but the very principle of the relativity and self-movement of all logical content. Its universality is concrete because it is always realized through particular dialectical processes. The absolute idea thus expresses the core of Hegel's system, the plastic, dynamic unfolding of thought as it unites itself with actuality, continually generating and integrating new forms. So, like absolute knowing in the phenomenology of spirit, the absolute idea in the science of logic is not an idea about a specific entity, object, or divine substance called the absolute. Rather, it designates the logical, dynamic self-movement of the concept, a concrete universal that is absolute in the sense that it embodies the absolute relativity of all thoughts. And finally, in Hegel's philosophy of mind, absolute spirit represents the culmination of his philosophical system as presented in the Encyclopedia. It is not something that hovers above history, but the active force that weaves through and animates history itself. Freedom, for Hegel, is the self-development of spirit according to its own concept, with the ultimate goal being truth, spirit's full self-consciousness and rationality realized in history. When spirit achieves awareness of itself as a concrete universal, it attains what Hegel names the eternally actual truth. This actualization unfolds in three moments: in art, as an intuition of the absolute through particular finite forms, then through religion, as the absolute content of spirit gains representation and image, and finally through philosophy, where spirit attains proper self-knowledge and fully grasps its own concept. Philosophy is the self-thinking absolute idea, where the content and form of absolute spirit are united in rational, conceptual understanding. At this stage, spirit recognizes itself as both the culmination and the origin of the dialectical process, returning to its beginning in a higher form. Hegel concludes this process with a reflection on the three great syllogisms, logic, nature, spirit, that structure his entire philosophical system. The first syllogism traces the movement from logic to nature and culminates in mind, spirit. This is the initial progression. Pure thought, logic, externalizes itself as nature, which then gives rise to mind. The second syllogism sublates the first. Here, mind, spirit, reflects on its own presupposition, nature, and, in doing so, determines and understands the logical principles underlying its own existence. This is the stage of self-conscious reflection. The third syllogism presents the logical idea as pure thought, which serves as the mediating term that divides into mind and nature. In this final syllogism, the two opposites, mind and nature, are unified within the logical idea. As Hegel notes, it is the concept, the nature of the subject matter, that moves onwards and develops, and this movement is equally the activity of cognition. Here, the dialectical process becomes fully dynamic. Nature and mind are reconciled, and from their unity emerges a new, higher form, absolute spirit. This dynamic and dialectical movement is the same process observed in absolute knowing and the absolute idea. With absolute spirit, however, the process incorporates not only logic and nature, but also human consciousness, and our capacity for rational self-understanding through philosophy. In sum, what is truly absolute in Hegel's system is not a fixed thing, but the absolute relativity and plasticity of all things, the unending self-mediating process by which spirit becomes conscious of itself and the world. Hegel's absolutes are absolutely plastic. They are without restriction or limitation, continually receiving and producing new forms. Far from being mystical enigmas or secret metaphysical entities, the absolutes do not name any object or thing. They signify the ongoing, self-developing process of thought and reality itself. The absolute is not a hidden, inaccessible mystery, but simply the dialectical, plastic movement of thought. It is nothing other than the self-unfolding process of becoming. There is no absolute thing behind the movement. The secret to Hegel's system is that there is no secret.